Hey guys, welcome back to our reading of The Whipping Boy. Today we're going to look at chapters 15 and 16. Now, just as a little review, because it's been a few days since we've read this book, in chapters 13 and 14, Jemmy escapes the two scoundrels. Prince Brat follows him, and then the two eventually meet up with a bear, if you remember, a bear named Petunia, and then they eventually meet up with the girl named Betsy who owns the bear. We find out that that's a circus bear, and that's important because you're going to meet that bear and that girl again. Meanwhile, Cutwater is chasing Prince Brat, who's chasing Jemmy, and he kind of gets lost in the woods and hears the bear and starts following the bear thinking that it's Prince Brat or Jemmy. So they escape Cutwater and Hold Your Nose Billy. So they head down to the river. They're looking for the river. And so at the end of chapter 14, they're heading toward the river and they come across some soldiers. The soldiers, they assume, are out looking for the prince. So they have a little discussion, and Jemmy reminds Prince Brat that, he should not be out there. He should be back at the palace. They argue a little bit because Jemmy does not want Prince Brat following him. He wants to be on his own. He wants to live out on the streets again. He wants to be a rat catcher like he was before. He wants to be finished with being the whipping boy for the prince. But Prince Brat won't let him go. He keeps following him. So the two are together again at the end of chapter 14. So now we're going to head into chapter 15 and see what happens next. Chapter 15 of the Hot Potato Man and Other Matters. The soldiers had passed by. Following the river, Jemmy ventured toward the city. Prince Brat strode along beside him. "Soon as I can, I aim to give you the slip," Jemmy warned. "You'll be on your own." The prince said nothing. The tide was low, and they traveled out of sight of the road, below a grassy embankment. In the distance, against billowing white clouds, stood a jackstraw jumble of ship's masts. "You can fend for your own self, can't you?" Jemmy asked suddenly. "Of course I can," answered the prince in a stinging voice. "I don't need flocks of servants to fetch and carry for me." "It's settled then." "Settled. Skip off any time you like." With the tide out, a wide mud flat lay exposed. From long habit, Jemmy kept his eyes peeled for treasure. Sandpipers scattered like mice before him. He spotted a barrel stave and pounced upon it. "Trash," remarked the prince. "What are you doing?" "Mudlarking." "What?" "I've got to eat, don't I? If I can collect enough driftwood, I can sell it as firewood." The prince shrugged and walked on ahead. Jemmy gazed after him for a moment. What did a prince know about living off the streets? His meals had always appeared on china plates and silver trays as if by magic. Left to himself, he'd starve. "It's not my worry," Jemmy muttered. "What?" "You, that's what. If you get hungry enough, you'll scramble back to the castle." The prince glared back at Jemmy and then stooped down to retrieve the broken leg of a chair from the mud. "Is this worth anything?" Jemmy nodded. Before long, the two of them had collected 3 more barrel staves and the back of the chair. Then Jemmy found something even more valuable to him, a bent and battered bird cage. He could go into business with that. Straightened out, it would hold rats. They rounded a bend, and the crack of a whip sounded in the air like a firecracker. Jemmy crawled up the embankment for a look. A weary old coach was mired in a mud hole on the road. The coachman, looking just as old and rickety, held the reins of his two-horse team and cracked his whip in the air again. "Pull, gents! Be good, lads! It's me own fault not leading you around this bog. Me eyesight ain't what it was, is it, old lads?" Jimmy watched for another moment as the horses tried to pull the coach free. The coach was enameled blue, with yellow lettering painted on the door panel. Captain Harry Nips, Hot Potato Man. Jimmy crawled over the embankment. A ride to the city would suit him fine. "Sir, would you take on a passenger? Here, let me set these barrel staves under the wheels." "Don't mind if you do," said Captain Nips. "I'm late for the fair as it is." Jemmy busied himself, laying a firm track for the wheels. Prince Brat watched from the edge of the embankment. So Jemmy is helping the horses out of the mud by using the wood that he and the prince had found and kind of making nice solid planks for them to pull the cart out of. "You must be carrying a heavy load," Jemmy cried out. "Try again, Cap'n." The old man cracked his whip, the horses strained, and the coach rolled up out of the bog. "Hop in, lad." Jemmy opened the door and saw that the coach was heavily loaded with raw potatoes and a huge iron kettle. Jemmy settled himself as best he could, and the coach lurched forward. At last, Jemmy thought, "You're free of the prince." But he couldn't resist a backward glance. Prince Brat was standing in the center of the road. He dropped his load of driftwood and merely gazed at the receding coach. Jemmy straightened and folded his arms. The prince wasn't his lookout any longer, but he'd stood there like a wounded bird. Blast him! A prince hadn't a cockeyed notion how to fend for himself. "Stop, Captain!" Jemmy shouted. "We left me friend behind." The hot potato man pulled up on the reins. Jemmy leaned out a window. With an arm, he motioned Prince Brat to come along. For an instant, Jemmy thought he saw a smile flash across the prince's face, but it had vanished by the time the heir to the throne joined him inside the coach. They rode in silence. Jemmy wondered what had possessed him to refer to the prince as his friend. Friend? Cows would give beer first. Then, minutes later, the coach rocked to a sudden halt. "Stand and deliver," came a shout. A pair of highwaymen were training pistols on the Captain Nips. Jemmy hardly had to peer out. The voice was familiar. It was Hold Your Nose Billy and Cutwater. Ugh, I thought they had lost them for good. Chapter 16, wherein the prince neither bawls nor bellows. Jemmy felt a surge of the creeps. Run for it? He wondered. Instead, he began to burrow out of sight under the loose heap of potatoes. "Remember," he whispered to the prince, "it's me they're after, not you. Tell 'em we split up. Tell 'em I swam the river." Prince Brat merely looked at him. The voices outside boomed. "Stand and deliver, I said." "And I heard you," exclaimed Captain Nips. "Deliver what? Potatoes? Scurvy rascals. Help yourselves." "Hang your potatoes," roared Hold Your Nose Billy. "Deliver us some information and you can be off. We're after 2 runaway apprentices." "Apprentice highwaymen?" Captain Nips scoffed. "Our affair. Girl with a bear said she saw him streaking for the river. You carrying passengers?" Jemmy pulled the iron kettle over his head. A coach door was yanked open, and Jemmy could hear Cutwater's muffled cackle. Got one. The whipping boy it is. Where's your master, eh? Jemmy held his breath. He had no reason to believe that the prince wouldn't betray him again. There came a stiff pause. And then Prince Brat said, "Swim the river." By then, Hold-Your-Nose Billy had ripped open the opposite coach door. Even through the kettle, Jemmy imagined he could smell garlic. Swim to the river? Faugh! He'd need scales and fins. Hardly a moment later, the kettle was grabbed off and Jemmy's head stood exposed. "Here's the potato we're after," Hold-Your-Nose Billy roared gleefully. Jemmy and the prince were yanked out of the coach, and the big outlaw shouted to Captain Nips, "Throw me down your horsewhip and drive on." Hanging on to each boy by the scruff of the neck, the highwaymen scrambled out of sight below the embankment. Hold-Your-Nose Billy looked angry enough to throttle Jemmy on the spot. "Tricked me, did ya?" he bellowed. "Flummoxed me with your fancy quill scratching." The game's up, Jemmy thought. He's tumbled that the ransom note ain't worth scat. But trying to look as innocent as possible, he replied, "Sir?" "A gold sack or two would have satisfied me and Cutwater," snarled the hairy outlaw. "Greedy ain't our middle name. But you, raising the ante to a great cartload, reckoned to slow us down, didn't you? It would be easier to drag around a dead horse. If we ain't light-footed, we're caught. That was your scheme." What a pair of fools, Jemmy thought. That hadn't been his scheme at all. "You've got it all wrong," he declared. "I swear it." "Aye, enough plunder to burden us directly to the gallows, eh?" Hold-Your-Nose Billy continued. "Well, here's a whipping you won't never forget." He snapped Captain Nip's whip in the air to get the feel of it. "Here's the whipping boy," Cutwater put in. "You said it'll go powerful worse for us if we thrash the prince himself." Hold-Your-Nose Billy nodded sharply. Cutwater upturned the prince, holding him by the ankles in the air. "Go to it, Billy." Jemmy finally found his voice. "Lay down the whip," he commanded with a princely air. "Don't you have an ounce of sense between you?" "Hold your gab." "Simpletons. You can just fill your pockets with plunder and be light-footed as ever," Jemmy declared. "Nobody flummoxes Hold-Your-Nose Billy and gets away with it." The whip snapped across the prince's back. Jemmy held his breath. He knew what it felt like. He saw that Prince Brat had set his jaws, just as Jemmy had always done, and not a sound escaped his lips. "Harder," Cutwater advised. "You didn't raise a peep out of him." The big man let fly again. "He must have a hide like an elephant," said Cutwater. "He don't feel a thing." "He'll feel this," Hold-Your-Nose Billy thundered, and the leather whistled through the air. The prince's jacket was being shredded. "Ball out!" Jemmy shouted. He dreamed of seeing the prince whipped, but now that it was happening, he found no satisfaction in it. "Holler and cry out! I won't tell anyone." But Prince Brad only girded himself for the next blow. From the top of the embankment came an outraged voice. Betsy and her dancing bear stood there. "Ruffian!" she cried out. "What are you doing to that poor boy?" "No business of yours," snarled Cutwater. "Stop it!" But Hold-Your-Nose Billy raised the whip again. The next thing Jemmy knew, the girl had slipped the rope from around the bear's neck. "Sick 'em, Petunia! Go get 'em!" And that is the end of chapter 16.